interesting. Be a bit of a challenge. Don't just serve yourself up on a silver platter and let her decide if you're good enough. Make her qualify herself to you. Make her sell herself to you.
As a dating coach, I always enjoy meeting other guys who get girls. Not just in the literal sense, but also guys who get the underlying psychology of what creates attraction. And one guy who definitely gets tons of women, both in the literal and figurative sense, is Dan Bilzerian. I met Dan back in 2014 through a mutual friend, and over the years, I've spent enough time hanging out with Dan that I can definitely say that he's the real deal. I've seen firsthand the sorts of top-tier women that Dan has in his life. And maybe even more impressive, I've seen Dan reject women that most guys would blow a gasket over. There was one time in particular when Bobby Rio and I, we were chilling at Dan's house in Vegas, and these three girls showed up, and these girls were kind of groupies. They wanted to meet him. And they were certainly attractive, but they weren't even a blip on Dan's radar. And now, as a dating coach, I've seen guys fake disinterest or they pretend not to notice a woman. But what really struck me about Dan was how genuinely unimpressed he was by these girls. And what was even more interesting was seeing how the girls responded to that, watching them work themselves into a frenzy trying to get Dan's attention. It kind of reminded me of how thirsty guys behave. Watching it unfold in real time, it was like sitting in on a masterclass on how to get women to chase. Now, some guys might be sitting there thinking, well, that's because Dan's rich, or that's because Dan's a celebrity. But look, I've hung out with enough guys, I've even coached guys who have more money or were even more famous than Dan, but I have never seen anyone have the sort of effect on women that Dan does. You can be skeptical if you want, you can believe whatever you want, but if you're curious to learn what Dan does differently, then stick around because that's what I'm going to explain in this video. Now, like I said before, I've been friends with Dan since 2014, but it wasn't until 2022 that I really did a deep dive into what specifically makes Dan so good with women. Basically, why this guy is the modern day Hugh Hefner. And the reason I got such a close look at Dan's approach was because he sent me an early draft of his autobiography, The Setup, which I highly recommend checking out. And the reason Dan did that is because he wanted my take on it since I am a dating coach, and he was interested to hear my thoughts on the sections that focus on, his approach to women and attraction. Now, in the book, Dan weaves lessons that he learns into stories, which are actually pretty shockingly honest. It's easy to look at Dan now and think that this guy's never gotten rejected or he's never had a struggle with women. But in the book, he explains that a lot of what he does now, and essentially how he understands women, it all goes back to stuff that he learned, and he learned that through some brutal incidents, and these are incidents from his childhood and early adulthood. The situations and rejections that Dan details are things that really any guy can relate to, but the interesting part is how Dan responded and what changes he made to do things differently. Now again, I recommend reading the book for yourself because there's really only so much I can cover in a video like this. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to highlight one of the mindset shifts that I found most interesting in the book. Now, this is the paradigm that Dan adopted that I really haven't heard or seen anywhere else, or at least not in the way that Dan applies it to dating and attraction. And now it's how Dan perceives his own value. If you've studied any men's dating advice, you probably know that women are attracted to high-value men. A man's value is determined by obvious things like his social status or his appearance, but it can also be more subtle characteristics like charisma, like humor, personality, intelligence. Now, the typical guy, he tries to attract women by displaying that value, right? So that's why guys drive flashy cars. That's why guys pay for VIP bottle service at nightclubs. They're trying to display status, which they hope translates to value and ultimately attraction from women. Likewise, a lot of men's dating advice, a lot of stuff that I teach, it focuses on improving a guy's social skills, improving his personality, his confidence, his humor, so that he can display the sort of value that women find attractive. Now, when you look at Dan, it's easy to see his value now, right? Because he's a rich celebrity, he's got lots of followers, fans, whatever. Everyone can see that. But what no one ever asks is, how did Dan attain his status and his celebrity? And while part of it is that Dan's dad was a successful businessman, there are plenty of other guys who come from affluence, who come from generational wealth, but they're not Dan Bilzerian. So how did Dan become Dan? Now, I think the answer to that is buried in a story from Dan's early adulthood, at a time after he'd served in the military and he had just enrolled in college. Now, keep in mind, at this point, Dan's in his mid-20s, And, he's been through a lot. He's sitting in class, he's listening to a lecture being delivered by your typical liberal arts professor. And you could probably imagine the type, the professor who thinks that he's the man because he spent his life in the library, the kind of guy who just like oozes entitlement, probably wearing a tweed jacket, and that tweed jacket probably has elbow pads. And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to read what happened next straight from the setup because it's really, Dan's story to tell here. I'd found an online sports book that also had a poker site attached called Bodog. This was a big deal because sports bettors would wander into the poker room and blow their newfound winnings. I recorded the biggest monthly win in Bodog's poker history, clearing around $400,000, playing 3 tables with a max buy-in of only $2,000 per table. That week, a professor said something to me in a condescending way, and I was in no mood to take shit. "Who the fuck do you think you are?" I said. "I'm your professor, and you will not use profanity in my class." "You think you can talk down to me just because you've read some books?" "I have a master's degree. What have you done? Graduate high school?" "Nah, I got a GED, but I'm a veteran, and I made more money in the last week than you will in the next 3 years." The professor stood there dumbfounded for a second, and then fired back. "If you're so rich, why are you in college?" As stupid as it sounds, I hadn't really considered dropping out, but the asshole, he did have a point. I sat there in silence for about 6 seconds and thought about it. That is the first intelligent thing you've said all semester. And you're right. I'm out. Enjoy earning $30,000 a year, you fucking dipshit. The kids went crazy as I walked out of the classroom and shut the door on my college career. So this story, it's more than just a funny anecdote where some stuffy chode gets his comeuppance. If you really put yourself in Dan's shoes, think about how would you have handled that? Even if you were defiant, would you really be able to stand there and assert your value without buckling under the social pressure? For most guys, the answer is probably not. The thing I love about this story is Dan wasn't being a disruptive dick. The reason it's funny is that he's making valid points. It's literally the definition of speaking truth to power. And most guys, they're too respectful or they're too timid to stand up in front of an authority figure and matter-of-factly assert their value. And now look, I'm sure that there's going to be comments that are going to say that Dan's a dick or that, oh, that's easy to do. It's easy to have that kind of moxie when you're rich or when you're famous. But that's the thing about the story. Dan wasn't rich or famous at this time, and he really wasn't being a dick. It's a story that could have happened at any college campus today, because at the time, Dan was just another student just like everyone else. But the reason this scene won't play out today and it's not going to play out tomorrow or anytime soon is because we've been socially conditioned not to assert our value as men, to constantly second guess and to constantly question our value as men. Consider what Dan does at this point. He'd gone through military training, right? He was in peak physical shape. He made his own money. And he made his own money by learning a skill and taking risks, by playing poker. Now, what sort of qualities does that convey? It conveys strength. It conveys courage, discipline, dedication. These are all important and valuable traits. Yet, how would a woke, pudgy college professor see it? Probably as toxic masculinity.
Toxic masculinity.
Toxic masculinity.
Toxic masculinity.
Toxic masculinity.
The toxic masculine.
Toxic masculinity.
Toxic masculinity.
Toxic masculinity.
Toxically masculine.
Now, I don't care if this makes me sound like a tinfoil hat wearing lunatic, but this social conditioning is precisely why most guys aren't happy. And it's definitely why most guys suck at attracting women. They have fallen for the scam of buying into the narrative that valuable masculine qualities are bad or toxic. This is classic Orwellian doublespeak, where peace is war, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. Now, Dan puts the counter argument on steroids, literally. But here's the thing. There's nothing stopping you from doing the same damn thing other than that voice in your own head that's telling you to be a nice guy, that's telling you to comply with the social conditioning that you've accepted as reality. I've met a lot of guys who are good with women, and the one thing they all have in common is none of them are nice guys. Most of them are good guys, they're ethical guys, but none none of them would be considered nice. Look, most of these guys, they would be more than happy to help someone out and treat them with respect, but they're not going to do it at the expense of their own self-worth and dignity. Nice guys think by putting themselves last that they're somehow virtuous, that they're somehow righteous, but that's not the way the world works. You can't help anyone when you have no power and you have no respect. A nice guy doesn't even respect himself, so why would anyone else? And when people don't respect you, you have no power. Contrast that with Dan. Clearly, he respects himself, but not because of some delusional sense of entitlement. Dan's a guy who has a personal code, who set a standard for himself and then actively worked to live up to that standard. So that's why when he put that professor in his place, he didn't make some Gen Z argument that he should be respected because his feelings matter or any nonsense like that. The problem with most of these clowns that you see on social media giving advice or whatever the fuck they're doing is that they think they can demand respect or demand your validation based on things they didn't work for. It's no different from that fat girl who says that she's a 10 and gets cheered on by polite society. Look, you can say whatever you want. You can tell yourself whatever story that you want, but the rubber meets the road in the real world. Love him or hate him, Dan's rich, he's successful, and he's pulling tons of girls. And that's because he sets a high standard for himself. And he does the hard work to live up to that standard. And because of that, he has no problem asserting his worth in the world, which then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And spoiler alert, that's why the title of the book is The Setup, because it's about setting yourself up to succeed. That means waking up and putting in the work every damn day so that you can lead an easy life. But again, it's not simply working aimlessly. You need to identify the characteristics and qualities that are actually important, the stuff that's actually valuable, and focus your efforts on those things. That's setting your standard. And notice how I said setting your standard, as in your own standard, and not simply adopting a standard imposed on you by Hollywood or the media or some pretentious college professor. We all know those institutions are corrupted, yet still, we let their pervasive influence dictate what we're willing to stand up for or speak out against. So if you want to start living more like Dan Bilzerian and less like a chubby liberal arts professor, the first thing you need to do is set a standard for yourself. Not a standard that's politically correct or woke or any of that nonsense. Set a standard that aligns with your idea of a strong, attractive, autonomous man and put the work in. Put the work in every damn day. No excuses. It's so simple in theory, yet so few men follow through and actually do it. So the choice is yours. It's simple and it's stark. Either set up your life or live your life settling. In other words, work hard and live easy, or avoid the work, put it off another day, and live miserably. The choice is yours.